Hello everyone, Professor Kusluch here. So welcome back to our discussion on American public policy. Today I wanted to make a video kind of talking about chapters 1 and the introduction. So introduction in chapter 1 for Douglas Irwin's Free Trade Under Fire. So we started reading this week and discussing this. I just wanted to make a video wrapping up, making sure we're on the same page with the important parts of the reading. Sorry if you hear my huskies in the background. They're both hanging out in here, and it's almost walk time, so they're getting ready and excited for go time. But I wanted to make a video talking about introduction, chapter 1 of Douglas Irwin's Free Trade Under Fire. So together these readings give us both kind of a historical background and the analytical tools to understand how trade shapes and is shaped by American public policy. Through these two chapters, we see why trade has always been kind of a politically contentious issue, politically contested. We know, and we'll talk about here, how globalization has reshaped the U.S. economy. We'll see this throughout the book, and what that means for today's public policy debates about tariffs, supply chain, and America's global role. All things that we hear in the news, we hear just even if we're passive observers of the news. We hear about tariffs and trade and supply chain issues, which was a huge issue during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. So Irwin's Free Trade Under Fire, let's think about the first two chapters, introduction and chapter 1. So Irwin begins by emphasizing that trade has always been what he called, quote, under fire. Unlike some areas of economics where experts largely agree on solutions, trade is inherently political. That's because trade policy directly affects people's livelihoods. Jobs, wages, even whole industries can rise or fall depending on whether the U.S. opens its markets or restricts imports. So we know that trade is probably more politically contentious than the majority of policies that we hear about in the news. So different groups interpret trade very differently. For some, trade is a driver of prosperity, expanding markets, lowering costs for consumers, allowing consumers to be able to shop at big box stores for a cheaper price. However, for others, it is a threat. It hollows out communities. They argue it pushes down wages, or you hear about that it weakens national sovereignty or even national identity. So what's striking is that skepticism about trade kind of crosses ideological lines. Progressives like Bernie Sanders oftentimes criticize trade, arguing it harms workers, it fuels inequality, that it undermines environmental standards. Conservatives sometimes argue that trade agreements limit U.S. sovereignty or make the country overly reliant on rivals or adversaries or just on countries outside of the U.S. So this brings together a pretty diverse coalition of critics. Labor unions worried about job losses, farmers worried about retaliation, environmentalists concerned about sustainability, human rights advocates who focused on working conditions abroad, and security hawks, national security hawks, who are worried about strategic dependence on outside countries. Because of this unusual overlap, trade debates rarely settle permanently. Instead, they flare up again and again, each time with new focal points, but the same underlying tension over and over. And we've seen this historically. We are living through an era, where we know trade is hotly contested. It is an issue in the campaign trail as well as within the Trump administration right now. So trade controversies are, as we said, not this recent phenomenon. President Trump certainly brought them back into the spotlight with some rather dramatic actions. Pulled the U.S. out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He renegotiated NAFTA, creating the USMCA during his first administration, and recently imposed tariffs on steel, aluminum, and Chinese goods, Indian goods. We hear about these in the news. During his first administration, I think it was during his first administration, he even embraced the label tariff man. If you listen to his interviews, you watch his interviews today, he's still talking about tariffs. And he was recently giving a speech where he said tariffs are his favorite word. So this has become a hallmark of the Trump administration's policy. So this heavily utilization of tariffs has marked a bit of a sharp break from the bipartisan consensus in favor of freer trade that has guided U.S. policy for much of World War II. We know we have seen pushback by labor unions and by Democratic politicians, but we have seen both political parties, at least the leadership, embracing quite a bit of free trade policies. And so when we look back, we see this as a bit of a repeating cycle. In the 1980s, Japan was the main focus of anxiety. Its dominance in the automobile industry and electronics led to fears that the United States was becoming outcompeted. And then in the 1990s, NAFTA provoked pretty intense debates. Ross Perot famously warned about the giant sucking sound of jobs moving to Mexico. And in the 2000s, concerns shifted towards outsourcing jobs to India and the growing trade deficit with China. And then in the 2010s, China became really the central concern. Not only for economic reasons, but also because of geopolitical rivalries between the U.S. and China, especially as China was quickly industrializing, their economy was quickly growing. So the key takeaways is that the villain has changed, who the U.S. is competing with has changed, but the structure of the debate remains the same. Trade generates benefits for the economy overall, but those benefits are spread widely, while the costs are quite concentrated. Politics responds more strongly to concentrated pain than to diffuse gains, which keeps trade under fire, according to our author. Again, sorry if you can hear my huskies in the background there. Very much ready to go for their walk. So, Chapter 1, so the introduction lays out this argument, lays out the path that the book's going to take. And then in Chapter 1, it shifts to the economic foundations of these debates. So when we look back and the author lays out this argument, that in 2018, U.S. exports accounted for about 12% of GDP, and imports about 15%. By historical standards, this is a very high degree of global integration. Before World War I, trade was only about 7% of GDP. During the Great Depression, it collapsed under the weight of tariffs and economic crises. But since the 1970s, trade has surged thanks to containerization, tariff reductions, and trade agreements. Today, no sector of the American economy is isolated. Farmers depend on exports. Boeing sells planes worldwide. Consumers rely on imported electronics and clothing. Even universities are part of the trade flow. Foreign students studying in the U.S. count as service exports. There is really no longer a side note. Trade is really no longer a side note to the U.S. economy. It is central to how we live and how we work, the industries that we are in, the products that we buy. So our author lays out, Douglas lays out, that the U.S. does play this big role in importing, but also in exporting. So the U.S. exports a lot agricultural goods like soybeans and corn, which is again in the news right now. It's in the news because China has cut back or eliminated, really, the number is basically down to zero, their imports of soybeans from the U.S. Well, this is a big hit to American farmers because it is such a key export for Americans. Manufactured goods like aircraft and chemicals, and increasingly energy. When I talk to students in the classroom, they are surprised at the amount of energy that the United States actually pulls out of the ground and then exports. It's not something that Americans oftentimes think about, but we know it is a huge export and a huge piece of the American economy. So then what do Americans import? Consumer goods like electronics, apparel, as well as cars, automobile parts, industrial inputs. The U.S. exports a lot and the U.S. imports a lot. So a key detail for policy is that many of the imports are intermediate goods. Inputs U.S. industries need. For example, steel tariffs may help U.S. steel producers, but they raise costs for automobile makers and construction firms who rely on those goods. That means protection for one group oftentimes creates new burdens for another group. So this complexity, the author argues, is why trade policy is so difficult to design. It's never simply a choice between helping Americans and hurting foreigners. It's about deciding which Americans benefit and which Americans will bear the costs of trade policy. So Douglas lays out that trade is not just about goods. The U.S. is also a global leader in service trade, which when we hear service, we might think of like working at a restaurant. But the service industry is much greater and much wider. It can be finance, it can be consulting, intellectual property, entertainment, and, as we said, education. In fact, the U.S. runs a trade surplus in services. It's a huge part of the U.S. economy. There's also foreign direct investment. U.S. companies like Apple and Ford operate abroad, while foreign firms like Toyota and BMW operate here in the U.S. Outsourcing tends to get attention, but insourcing, foreigners creating American jobs, oftentimes gets less notice, even though it matters just as much. So Douglas is saying that our understanding of trade oftentimes is not holistic. We don't think about all of these things and how all of these things work together. So finally, there are global supply chains. The iPhone is the example that we used in class, many students wrote about, and our author writes about. The iPhone is a prime example. Assembled in China, but with components from the UK, the US, maybe not the UK, but definitely the US, Japan, Korea, Germany, maybe in the UK. I don't quite remember if he talked about it. Yet trade data credits the full value to China. This illustrates how kind of misleading trade statistics are, or trade statistics can be. and how deeply interconnected modern production of goods really is. So, for policymakers, this raises tough questions. When we impose tariffs, who actually pays? Often it's not just a foreign firm, it's American businesses and consumers as well. So, a key piece of the reading was about why did globalization accelerate so much in recent decades? So we've seen falling transportation costs, especially with container shipping, which dramatically lowered the cost of moving goods. Dramatically. Before container shipping, goods would have to be hand loaded and then unloaded and then loaded again and unloaded every step of the way. Now it's in a container. That container can be taken on and off a ship in a matter of minutes instead of a matter of hours or days. So we've also seen technological advances like the internet and digital logistics, which make it and has made it easier to coordinate production across borders. We can communicate instantaneously. We know what we need, and we can have those orders at the touch of a button. Technological advances and innovations have made trade so much easier. And policy decisions, both in the US and abroad. Trade liberalization under the GATT, in the WTO, regional trade agreements like NAFTA, in reforms in countries like China and India have all played a role in opening markets for globalization. So we have seen this increase. Now we know there's pushback. We know there's pushback in the US, we know there's pushback around the world, a pushback to try to generate more industry at home. So, the authors didn't talk about it as much, but I wanted to bring it up as I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about in this video today. I wanted to dig a little deeper on what does this mean for public policy. So we know that tariffs and the implementation of tariffs, the implementation of trade agreements and globalization is a public policy decision, but I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into this. So we know and we've seen from our readings that economists emphasize efficiency. We did several readings where we talked about and looked at economists and their idea of efficiency. So economists argue that trade grows the economic pie, but distribution is uneven. Public policy then must decide, should it prioritize growth overall for the economy or protect certain industries from harm? So when we think of what kind of policy tools are at policymakers' disposal, we know tariffs. We've read about tariffs. We'll continue to read about tariffs. We hear about tariffs in the news, and something called quotas, which we haven't heard as much about in our readings. We haven't read as much about. But tariffs and quotas do protect industries, but raise consumer costs and risk retaliation. So the reason that China isn't buying soybeans is because they're retaliating against the US for our tariff policy. So from a public policy standpoint, we can see that there's pushback from countries that you might be putting tariffs on to protect your infant industry or to try to grow your industry or simply just protect a mature industry. But adversaries or even allies might retaliate, and this could lead to certain segments of your economy being hurt. There's also something called trade adjustment assistance, which is meant to retrain workers. We've seen historically this has been underfunded and hasn't always worked. A big case study of this is Youngstown, Ohio. After the steel mills started closing, big government programs to try to retrain workers to get them out of the steel mills, which were disappearing, those jobs were disappearing, into new jobs, into new industries. But when we look in hindsight of did those workers retrain, and then were they making as much money 5 years later as they had been before the steel mills closed, the empirical evidence shows that the retraining in Youngstown didn't really work out that well for workers. So we also see industrial policy, and we saw this certainly more under the under President Biden than we do under President Trump. The Trump administration really likes tariffs. The Biden administration was a little bit more in favor of simply industrial policy, such as the CHIPS Act, clean energy subsidies, of utilizing money and utilizing subsidies to try to prop up industries within the U.S. So maybe not just simply building trade barriers like with tariffs, but trying to grow infant industries. The CHIPS Act, clean energy subsidies are pretty good examples of industrial policy. Okay, so one last thing I wanted to talk about that I jotted down a couple of notes for is this idea of national security and resilience. So again, our author didn't talk about it, but as I was thinking about how to connect our reading to public policy a little bit more broad, one issue is national security. We've probably all heard about elected officials, politicians, people in government talking about the need for national security. So trade is no longer seen as just economic. It's also about security. If you watch C-SPAN and you're hearing speeches on the House floor, you'll oftentimes hear national security talked about when it comes to bills. Sometimes bills that don't even seem to have that much to do with national security. National security has really found its way into much of our trade discussion, our trade policy. So U.S. Policymakers worry about dependency on China for things like semiconductors, for rare earth minerals. COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine also really exposed supply chain vulnerabilities. So if there was a conflict that the U.S. was involved in, would they have access to the material they needed? Or would they kind of be relying on an adversary for what they needed? So this isn't a new discussion. I remember after the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan hearing Donald Rumsfeld on television talking about the issue of relying too much on outside countries. So not a new thing, but we absolutely hear it discussed today. So just to wrap up, I know I try to keep these under 20 minutes, but sometimes I write a little bit too long of a lecture and then it goes over. So just to wrap up, Irwin's introduction in chapter 1 remind us that trade is never just about economics. It is always about politics, values, and the competing demands of different groups. For us as students of public policy, the key is to see trade as a policy choice, not as an inevitability. Trade decisions distribute costs and benefits across society. They shape how the U.S. economy connects to the world and how America projects its power abroad. So we'll continue to read Irwin's book. I think it's an interesting and pretty approachable book for students. So this was introduction, chapter 1. We'll read chapter 2 for Monday and discuss it then. Thank you.